The moment Gertrude Barrett walked through the doors of the Millhaven Church Hall and felt the crowd press toward her like a single breathing animal, she understood why her mother had warned her that socials in a new town were not so different from being fed to wolves. It was the autumn of 1878, and the small cattle town of Millhaven, Texas, sat at the edge of everything, the edge of the frontier, the edge of civilization, and as Gertrude had recently discovered, the edge of her own courage. She had arrived 3 weeks prior by stagecoach from San Antonio, taking a position as the town's new schoolteacher following the departure of the previous one, a Mr. Hollis, who had apparently decided that teaching 40 children their letters was less appealing than prospecting for silver in Nevada. The school board had sent her a letter. She had accepted, and now here she was, 24 years old, with a trunk full of books, a pair of worn leather boots, and absolutely nobody in the world who knew her name in this county. The social had been organized by the ladies of the Millhaven Methodist congregation as a harvest celebration, and the whole of the surrounding range land had turned out for it. Cowboys in clean shirts with their hair slicked back with bear grease, ranchers' wives in their best calico, children darting between adult legs like fish through reeds. The fiddle player in the corner had already worked himself into a sweat, and the long tables along the wall sagged pleasantly under the weight of pies and cornbread and slow-roasted pork. Gertrude stepped inside and felt the press of bodies immediately. She was not a small woman. She stood nearly 5'7" and had the strong-boned frame of her father's farming family, but the room seemed designed to make her feel exactly that way. She clutched the small covered dish she had brought, a simple blackberry preserves cake that she had stayed up until nearly midnight finishing, and tried to find a space that was not already occupied by someone's elbow or someone's hat. She was angling toward the food table, thinking she might set down her cake and then position herself near the door where she could breathe, when it happened. The crowd shifted, and she was suddenly pressed sideways by a wave of bodies moving toward the fiddle, and she stumbled, pitching forward, bracing for an inevitable collision with whoever stood directly ahead of her. She did not fall. She did not collide with anyone. Instead, the large shape ahead of her simply moved, stepped backward, and then sideways, with a kind of deliberate, unhurried ease, creating a pocket of space where there had been none a moment before. Her momentum carried her forward into that space, and she caught her footing, and when she looked up she found herself standing in a small cleared area that had not existed 5 seconds ago, with room enough to breathe, to stand straight, to recover her dignity entirely. She looked for whoever had made it, and her eyes found him immediately, because he was not difficult to find. He was the largest man in the room. That was the only way to put it. He was enormous in the straightforward, uncomplicated way that certain men occasionally are, not fat, not swollen with anything unhealthy, but simply built on a scale that seemed to belong to a slightly different world than the one everyone else occupied. He stood at least 6 feet and 4 inches tall, with shoulders so broad they blocked the lamp behind him and cast a long shadow down the floorboards. His hands, she noticed, were the size of small shovels. His dark hair was cut short and neat, and he wore a plain white shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and dark trousers tucked into well-kept boots. He was not wearing a hat, which was unusual at a social, and his face was clean-shaved and open, and had the weathered quality of a man who spent nearly every hour of his life outdoors. He had stepped back to give her room. She had noticed that before she noticed anything else about him, before his size, before his face, before the quiet steadiness of the way he stood. She had noticed the gesture first, and only afterward catalogued the man who had made it. He was not looking at her. He had turned slightly away, as though stepping back had been the most natural and unremarkable thing in the world, and was now watching the fiddle player with a mild expression of interest. Gertrude stood in the space he had made for her, caught her breath, and stared at the side of his face for a moment longer than was entirely polite. Then she walked to the food table and set down her cake. She did not seek him out that evening. She told herself it was because she had other duties. She needed to introduce herself to the school board chairman, a Mr. Aldridge, who had spotted her from across the room and was making his way toward her with his wife in tow. She needed to meet the families of her future students. She needed to be gracious and warm and make the kind of impression that would serve her well come Monday morning. All of that was true. But she also did not seek him out because something about him made her feel uncertain in a way she did not entirely have a word for. And Gertrude Barrett had spent 24 years building a strong preference for situations she could name clearly. Mr. Aldridge was a round, cheerful man who smelled of tobacco and was enormously pleased with himself for having secured a proper schoolteacher. His wife, Eleanor, was thin and observant and shook Gertrude's hand with both of hers and said, "We are so very glad you've come, Miss Barrett. The children are in desperate want of direction." This was said with such warm sincerity that Gertrude decided she liked Eleanor Aldridge immediately. The evening moved around her pleasantly enough. She met the Carver family, whose 3 children would be in her school. She met old Pastor Whitfield, who asked her whether she intended to lead the children in prayer at the start of each day, and seemed relieved when she said that she would. She ate a plate of pork and cornbread, and thought it was the best meal she'd had since leaving San Antonio. She did not see the large man again for the better part of an hour. When she did see him, he was standing near the back wall with a cup of cider, talking to a lanky, red-haired younger man who was laughing at something. The large man was not laughing exactly, but his expression had shifted into something that might have been the very beginning of a smile, a crease at the corner of his mouth, a slight softening around the eyes. He looked, Gertrude thought, like a man who found the world mildly amusing but did not feel any urgent need to announce that fact. Eleanor Aldridge appeared at her elbow as if by conjuration. "I see you've noticed Owen Bancroft," Eleanor said pleasantly. Gertrude startled. "I was merely looking at the room generally." "Of course you were," Eleanor said, in a tone that suggested she believed nothing of the kind. "He runs the Bancroft spread, about 7 miles east of town. Came out here from Kentucky 9 years ago, bought land that everyone said was too dry to be worth anything and proved everyone considerably wrong. He sells cattle to the rail line at Fort Worth now, does well." She paused. "He is also," she added, "a widower." Gertrude looked at Eleanor. "That is not information I asked for." "No," Eleanor agreed cheerfully. "I simply thought it was relevant context." "Relevant to what?" "To the room generally," Eleanor said, and went to fetch more cider. Gertrude turned back to the room and did not look at Owen Bancroft for the next 20 minutes, which she felt was a perfectly respectable demonstration of self-control. Then the fiddle player struck up a reel, and people began clearing a space for dancing, and in the reorganization of bodies that followed, she found herself standing approximately 5 feet from Owen Bancroft with nobody in between them. He looked at her. She looked at him. He had gray eyes. She had not expected gray eyes. They were a particular shade of gray, neither stormy nor flat, but something in between the color of creek water over pale stones on an overcast day. They were also, she noted, entirely direct. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something he is trying to understand, not with aggression or presumption, but with a careful, honest attention. "You're the new schoolteacher," he said. His voice was low and even, and had a slight Kentucky cadence to it that she had not expected from a Texas rancher. "Gertrude Barrett," she said. "Yes." "Owen Bancroft." He did not offer his hand, which struck her as either very rude or very considerate, and she was not sure which. Then she realized he was holding a cup in his right hand and there was no graceful way to transfer it, and she understood that he had simply noticed that fact and chosen not to make the situation awkward. "I have an apology to make," he said. She blinked. "For what?" "Earlier, when the crowd shifted. I stepped back and I am fairly certain I trod on someone's foot in the process. Not yours," he added quickly, "but someone else's. I heard a yelp." She stared at him for a moment and then she laughed. It came out entirely without permission, a real laugh, not the polite kind she had been producing all evening. "That is a very specific apology." "I prefer specific ones," he said. General apologies seem like a way of apologizing without actually taking responsibility for anything in particular. That is a surprisingly philosophical position for a harvest social. "There is not a great deal to do in the evenings on a cattle ranch," he said. "A man thinks." She considered him. The crowd was moving around them and nobody seemed to be paying them any particular attention. The fiddle was building toward something lively. "What do you think about?" she asked, and then immediately felt that it was perhaps too direct a question for an introduction. But he did not seem bothered by it. He considered the question with the same careful attention he had been giving her face. "Mostly practical things," he said. "Water rights, fencing, whether the north pasture is holding up." A brief pause. "Sometimes other things, such as," he looked at her steadily, "whether the things a man gives up are worth what he got in return." The fiddle burst into a full reel and someone shouted for partners, and the moment broke apart like a thing made of smoke. Owen Bancroft nodded to her, a slow, deliberate nod that managed to be both courteous and somehow personal, and moved away into the crowd. Gertrude stood where she was for a moment, breathing carefully. Then Eleanor Aldridge appeared again at her elbow. "Well," she said. "He is very direct," Gertrude said. "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "He always has been." His wife appreciated it tremendously, I think, though it confused some people. She paused delicately. "She passed 4 years ago, fever. They had no children." Gertrude looked at Eleanor with frank exasperation. "You are being very deliberate about this." "I am being neighborly," Eleanor said primly. "It is entirely different." Gertrude did not dance that evening, because she did not know anyone well enough to feel comfortable being that close to them, and because the fiddle player had a tendency to speed up at unpredictable moments that made the whole enterprise seem hazardous. She stayed until the social began to wind down, said her courteous farewells, and walked the 6 blocks back to the small house the school board had provided for her, carrying her empty cake dish. The night was enormous and black and full of stars in the way that nights in Texas have a habit of being, as though someone has scattered chips of quartz across the darkness and then lit them from behind. The air smelled of dust and dried grass and something faintly smoky from the chimneys of the houses she passed. Somewhere to the east, a coyote called once and then was quiet. She thought about gray eyes and a man who stepped back to give her room. She told herself it was a small thing and meant nothing in particular. She did not entirely believe herself. Monday morning came, and with it 37 children between the ages of 6 and 14, who regarded Gertrude Barrett with the combined skepticism of people who have seen teachers come and go, and have learned not to invest their hopes prematurely. The schoolhouse was a single-room building that smelled of chalk dust and old wood, with windows on the south side that let in good light and a potbelly stove in the corner that would be welcome in another month when the weather turned. Gertrude had spent Sunday afternoon arranging the desks and writing the alphabet in her best careful hand on the blackboard, and reminding herself that she had trained for this and was entirely capable of it. By noon on Monday, she had established that she was entirely capable of it, and also that 3 of the children were exceptionally bright, 4 were going to require extraordinary patience, and the rest fell somewhere in a broad, productive middle. She felt the particular satisfaction of a woman who has found her footing in a new situation and knows it. After school, she was sweeping the steps when she saw a horse and rider coming down the main street at a slow walk. The horse was a large dark bay, matching its rider in proportion, she thought, and then felt mildly ridiculous for thinking it. Owen Bancroft rode with the relaxed posture of someone who has been on horseback so long that it has become a natural extension of his body rather than a skill requiring active maintenance. He did not stop. He was clearly on his way somewhere, and the school was simply on that route. But he did glance over as he passed, and when he saw her standing on the steps with the broom, he touched the brim of his hat in the same deliberate, unhurried way he did everything else. She nodded back, and he rode on, and she swept the steps and went inside and sat at her desk for a moment longer than she needed to. The following Saturday she was at the general store, a wide, fragrant establishment run by a Mr. and Mrs. Prout, whose combined life philosophy seemed to be that everyone needed more of everything and that they were in a fortunate position to provide it. When Owen Bancroft came in to collect a supply order, she was examining bolts of fabric near the window, and he was at the counter discussing the weight of a coil of fence wire, and she watched the way he talked to Mr. Prout. He was courteous in a way that was not performative. He said please and thank you not as social lubricants but as words with actual content, as though he genuinely meant them and expected them to be received as such. When Mrs. Prout offered him a piece of the apple cake she had been slicing for a customer, he accepted it with what appeared to be genuine pleasure and said that it was excellent, which made Mrs. Prout color slightly with satisfaction. When he turned from the counter and saw Gertrude near the window, he did not look surprised to see her, which she found she appreciated. Some men became strange and formal upon an unexpected encounter, as though the situation required theatrical adjustment. He simply said, "Miss Barrett," in an even tone. "Mr. Bancroft," she returned. "How is the school getting on?" "Very well, I think. Your cowhand's children are in my class." Something shifted in his expression, a slight brightening. "Martinez's two boys, they're sharp." "Extremely," she confirmed. "Particularly the elder one. He has a gift for mathematics that I intend to encourage aggressively." Owen Bancroft nodded slowly. "Good," he said, with a simplicity that felt like conviction. "A man should have a trade he can build on." There was a pause that was not uncomfortable but was charged with a particular quality she could not quite catalog. Then he said, "I am taking my supply wagon back toward the East Road. If you are heading in that direction, the road can be rough in the afternoon when the dust rises. I could offer you a seat on the wagon." She looked at him. He looked back at her without any visible anxiety about what her answer might be, which she found oddly reassuring. He was asking because it was a practical offer and he would accept whatever she said without drama. "I live on the west side of town," she said. "Then the offer is not particularly useful," he agreed. "No," she said, "but it was kind." He nodded, picked up his coil of wire, tipped his hat, and walked out of the store. She watched him go through the window, watched him load the wire into his wagon with the quiet efficiency of a man who has done this 10,000 times and sees no reason to hurry or to make it look difficult. Mrs. Prout appeared at her elbow. This seemed, Gertrude reflected, to be becoming something of a pattern. "He came in twice last week," Mrs. Prout said, in a tone of perfect neutrality. "He must need a great deal of wire," Gertrude said. Mrs. Prout smiled the smile of a woman who has been watching people for 40 years and knows exactly what she is seeing. She said nothing further, which was, Gertrude thought, either very kind or very knowing or both. The first time they had a real conversation, not an exchange of pleasantries, not a brief practical interaction, but a conversation that actually went somewhere, was in October, about 6 weeks after the social. The weather had turned sharply cold overnight, the way Texas weather has a habit of doing without warning, and Gertrude had come out to the woodpile at the side of the schoolhouse to bring in more wood for the stove before the children arrived, and found that the woodpile was considerably lower than she had expected. She was calculating whether she could send one of the older students to the sawmill on Crane Street during the lunch hour when she heard a wagon, and then the sound of split logs being unloaded onto the woodpile with efficient regularity. She went around the corner and found Owen Bancroft, in a heavy coat and gloves, stacking wood. She stopped. He looked up. "You were going to run short," he said simply. "How did you know that?" "I passed by Tuesday and the pile was getting low." A pause. "I had the wood. It was not a considerable inconvenience." She stood in the cold morning air and looked at him. He had gone back to stacking with the unhurried competence she was beginning to recognize as characteristic. "You did not need to do this," she said. "No," he agreed. "But those children need to be warm, and you are new here and likely did not know where to order supply from. I could have figured it out." "Yes," he said, without any condescension at all. "I imagine you could have. You seem like someone who figures things out." He set the last log in place and straightened and pulled off one glove to reach for something in his coat pocket, which turned out to be a folded piece of paper. "The sawmill on Crane Street is run by a man named Cooper. He is reliable and his prices are fair. If you send him a note at the start of each month with your estimate for the coming weeks, he will ensure you don't run short again." He held out the paper. "I wrote down his rates." She crossed the yard and took the paper. Their fingers did not touch. She looked at the paper, which was in a large, careful hand, very legible. The rates were itemized and the note was signed Owen Bancroft in the same careful hand. She looked up at him. He was watching her with those gray eyes, and she thought she had never in her life met a man who watched the world so carefully and spoke so precisely about what he saw. "Thank you," she said, and meant it fully. He nodded, pulled his glove back on, and climbed onto his wagon seat. "Mr. Bancroft," she said. He looked back at her. "Would you like to come in for coffee? I have a kettle on. It is very cold." He held her gaze for a moment, and something moved through his expression that she could not fully read, not surprise exactly, but something adjacent to it, as though he had not expected the question and was taking a moment to assess it honestly. "Yes," he said, "I would." He tied the horse to the post and followed her inside, ducking his head with practiced ease through the schoolhouse door, and she poured 2 cups of coffee from the battered kettle on the stove, and they sat at the 2 chairs she had pulled to either side of the teacher's desk, and they talked for an hour before the first children began arriving. He told her about the ranch, how he had come to Texas in 1869 with $300, and a plan that the plan's critics had called optimistic to the point of delusion, and how he had spent the first 2 years in a one-room dugout on the prairie, learning the land the hard way, losing cattle to drought and weather and disease, and slowly, stubbornly, figuring out what the land would give him if he gave it what it needed. He talked about water, how finding water had been the crucial thing, how he had hired a man from New Mexico to help him read the terrain, how drilling the second well in the spring of 1872 had changed everything. She told him about San Antonio, about her father who had been a school teacher himself and her mother who had been a postmistress, about how she had grown up surrounded by books and correspondence, and the steady, reliable texture of a life built around learning. She told him about deciding to come to Millhaven, which had not been as reckless a decision as it might have looked from the outside, because she had been saving money for 3 years and had corresponded with the school board for 4 months before accepting the position, and she was not a person who made uninformed decisions. "You research your choices," he said. "Thoroughly." "So do I," he said. There was a pause, and both of them were aware of something in the air between them, something that had the quality of a statement waiting to be made, and neither of them made it, because a 6-year-old named Thomas Carver came barreling through the schoolhouse door at that moment, trailing his older sister and shouting about a jackrabbit he had seen in the road. Owen Bancroft set down his cup, stood, and said, "I will leave you to your work, Miss Barrett." "Thank you for the wood," she said. "You are welcome for the wood," he said, and left. Thomas Carver looked at the departing giant with round eyes and said, "Who is that?" "Mr. Bancroft," Gertrude said. "He is a rancher." Open your primer to page 12, please. November arrived, and with it the particular beauty of a Texas autumn, which is quieter and less theatrical than the autumns of other places, but has its own serious loveliness. The grass going gold and pale, the sky a deeper and more saturated blue than it manages in summer, the evenings arriving earlier and bringing with them a clarity of air that makes the stars look closer. Owen Bancroft began appearing on Friday afternoons. He was always on his way somewhere, or had just come from somewhere, and his route happened to take him past the schoolhouse at around the time school let out. They fell into the habit of talking on the steps while the children dispersed homeward, and then sometimes she would make coffee if she had not yet banked the stove fire, and they would sit and talk until the light faded. He told her about a mountain lion that had been troubling the cattle on the southern pasture, and the 3 days he had spent tracking it before it moved on of its own accord. She told him about the progress of the Martinez boys and how she was beginning to teach them geometry because they had moved through everything else she had for their age group and needed to be challenged further. He told her about his ranch hand, a Mexican man named Refugio, who had been with him since 1871, and who was the best horseman he had ever seen, and who had a wife in town named Catalina and 3 children under the age of 8, and who made a green chili stew that Owen said was the finest thing he had ever put in his mouth. She noticed that he spoke about the people who worked for him with genuine respect and attention, not with the paternalistic fondness that some employers had for their workers, but with the sort of recognition that acknowledged full humanity. When he spoke about Refugio's family, it was with the easy fluency of someone who knew them well and cared about their welfare not as an obligation, but as a natural consequence of being a person who paid attention. She found this remarkable. She did not say so, because she was not yet certain how much to say, or how much of what she was feeling was visible on her face. She suspected, from the way he sometimes looked at her between sentences, that he saw more than she intended. The trouble, when it came, arrived in the form of a man named Horace Ketley, who owned the largest cattle operation in the county, and who had a habit of expanding it through means that ranged from aggressive to outright coercive. He had been pressing Owen for the better part of a year to sell the eastern section of the Bancroft spread, which contained the second well and sat along the creek line in a way that would be enormously valuable to Ketley's operations. Owen had declined, and Ketley had not taken this well. Gertrude learned about it not from Owen, but from Eleanor Aldridge, who had a talent for knowing everything in Millhaven simultaneously. She came to the schoolhouse on a Thursday morning with a basket of corn muffins and the news that Ketley's men had cut 3 sections of Owen's fence line the previous week, and that several of Owen's cattle had wandered onto the road and caused significant inconvenience. "Is he all right?" Gertrude asked, before she had finished processing the question. Eleanor looked at her with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose suspicions have been thoroughly confirmed. She said only, "He is fine." He and Refugio spent 2 days restringing fence. That Friday, Owen appeared at the schoolhouse steps as usual, but he looked tired in a way she had not seen before, and there was a tightness around his mouth that suggested he was carrying something heavy. She did not ask about Ketley directly. She waited until they were inside with coffee, and then she said, "I heard about the fence line." He was quiet for a moment. He held his coffee cup in both hands and looked out the window at the pale late afternoon light. "News travels," he said. "This is a small town," he nodded. He was quiet for a long moment, and she waited, because she had learned that he was not a man who needed to be prompted. He would say what he meant to say in his own time. "Ketley wants the well," he said at last. "Without it, the eastern section is too dry to be worth much in a hard year. He knows that, and he's trying to make the whole enterprise uncomfortable enough that I'll reconsider selling." "Will you?" "No. Simple, flat, entirely without drama. That land is mine. I broke it and watered it, and it belongs to me and to whatever comes after me. I am not selling it because a man with more money than patience has decided he wants it." She looked at him. He was looking at the window. His jaw was set with a quietness that was not stubbornness exactly, but something more fundamental, a kind of bedrock refusal that went down past personality into character. "What will you do?" she asked. "Keep putting up fence," he said. "Keep doing what needs doing. Document every incident. I have a lawyer in Fort Worth who is already aware of the situation." He paused. "Ketley is a bully. Bullies have a pattern. They push until they find something that pushes back harder. And you are the thing that pushes back harder," she said. He turned from the window and looked at her with those gray eyes, and for the first time she saw something in them that was fully open, not guarded, not careful, but simply present. "I intend to be," he said. She held his gaze and felt something shift in her chest with all the quiet drama of a tectonic event. She said, "Good." The word came out with more feeling than she had intended, and neither of them looked away, and the quality of the air between them changed in a way that was unmistakable and required no inventory whatsoever. Then a log in the stove popped loudly, and they both startled, and the moment broke, and Owen stood and said he ought to get back, and she walked him to the door, and at the threshold he paused and turned back. "Miss Barrett," he said. "There is a—" he stopped, started again. "There is a place, about 2 miles east of town, where the creek bends around a stand of cottonwood trees. In the late autumn the light comes through the leaves in a particular way." I thought he stopped again, and she watched him navigate something that was clearly not natural territory for him, the articulation of an invitation that was not purely practical. "I thought if you were inclined it might be worth seeing." She looked at him standing in the doorway, enormous and patient and faintly uncertain. "When?" she said. "Sunday," he said, "if the weather holds." "Sunday," she said. "Yes." He nodded, and the corner of his mouth did the thing it had done at the social, that small crease that was the beginning of a smile. And he put on his hat and walked to his horse. And she stood in the door of the schoolhouse in the cold November air and watched him ride away, and felt as though the world had been slightly rearranged, while she was not paying close attention, and she was not certain she minded. Sunday was clear and cold and blue, with a wind that came from the north and smelled of distance. Owen arrived at her door at 9 o'clock with his horse and a smaller, quieter mare that he said was called Josephine, and was entirely trustworthy. She had ridden as a girl on her grandfather's farm in Tennessee, but not for some years, and she said so. He said that Josephine would not hold it against her. She pulled on her heaviest coat and gloves and climbed into the saddle, and they rode east along the creek road without any particular hurry. He pointed things out as they rode, not in the manner of a tour guide performing a duty, but the way someone points out things that he has noticed and found worth noticing. A pair of white-tailed deer moving through the brush below the creek bank. A hawk sitting absolutely still on a fence post, watching the ground with the total focused attention of the hunting. The way the creek curved away from the road just past the Colton property line, cutting a deeper channel than it had when he first came out here, which meant the upstream land had changed and was channeling more water down during the rains. "You watch everything," she said. "Land rewards watching," he said. "It tells you things if you pay attention." "So do people," she said. He glanced at her. "Yes," he agreed. "They do." The stand of cottonwood trees was everything he had suggested it might be. They stood in a rough circle around the inside curve of the creek bend, and they had not yet dropped their leaves, and the leaves were the color of pale gold, and when the wind moved through them, the sound was like something between rain and applause, and the light came through at an angle that made the whole grove glow from inside. The creek moved quietly below, and the blue sky above framed everything with the precise lack of sentiment that nature does not actually lack at all but pretends to. They stood at the edge of the grove, and she looked at it for a long time without saying anything. He stood beside her, a few feet of space between them, and he was also quiet. "This is remarkable," she said at last. "Yes," he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the trees with an expression she had not quite seen on him before, something quiet and full, the expression of a man who has lived with something beautiful for a long time and has not grown indifferent to it but has learned to hold it without grasping. "How long have you known about this place?" she asked. "Since 1871, he said. "I camped here one night in the autumn during a surveying ride. I have come back most autumns since." "Alone?" A pause. He looked at the creek. "Mostly," he said then. "I brought my wife the first year we were married. She liked it." This was the first time he had mentioned his wife in direct conversation with Gertrude, and the fact settled between them with care, like something placed rather than dropped. "What was her name?" Gertrude asked. "Clara," he said. His voice was even, but there was something in the evenness itself that spoke of effort and of the passage of time and of the kind of grief that has been lived with long enough to be carried rather than carried by. "She was from Virginia. She came out here knowing it would be hard, and she was right about that, and she did not complain about it." He was quiet for a moment. "She was very brave," he said, "and very honest." And she died in the summer of 1874, and I buried her on the eastern ridge where you can see the whole valley." Gertrude was quiet. "I am telling you this," he said carefully, "because I do not want you to feel that her memory is something I am avoiding or something that is going to appear between us as a complication later, when it would be more difficult to navigate." She looked at him. "You are being very deliberate," she said. "I am always deliberate," he said. "It is a character trait that some people find tiresome." "I do not find it tiresome," she said. He looked at her. The light was coming through the cottonwood leaves in drifting panels, and it moved across his face with a golden quality that made his gray eyes look warmer than usual, more complex. "Miss Barrett," he said. "Gertrude," she said. He paused for just a moment, and then he said her name the way a person says a word they have been saving. "Gertrude," and then, "I would like to continue seeing you with intention." She held his gaze. The creek moved. The leaves moved. The hawk somewhere behind them called once, sharp and clear. "With intention," she repeated. "Yes," he said. "I am not a man who is comfortable with ambiguity." "Neither am I," she said. A pause. "Then we are in agreement." "We are in agreement," she confirmed. He did not take her hand. He did not step closer. He simply looked at her with those clear gray eyes and nodded, and she felt that the nod meant considerably more than it appeared to, and that she and Owen Bancroft had just made a decision together that was going to have consequences they could not fully see from here, and that this was entirely fine. They rode back to town in the afternoon light, and the conversation on the way back was easy and warm, moving from the practical to the philosophical and back again without effort, the way conversation does when two people have found the particular frequency at which they speak the same language. December came with a genuine cold snap, and the children in the schoolhouse sat in their coats for the first hour each morning until the stove had done its work, and Gertrude found herself thinking of Owen as she stocked the woodpile, which was now reliably supplied through Mr. Cooper at the sawmill on Crane Street. He came on Sundays mostly, sometimes on a Friday afternoon. He brought things occasionally. A jar of honey from a ranch neighbor who kept bees, which he handed over with an almost formal straightforwardness, as though the gift were a statement that he simply wanted the statement's receipt acknowledged and nothing more made of it. She accepted it in the same spirit, which she could tell pleased him, because he had no patience for fuss. She made him dinner one Sunday in December, in the small kitchen of her house, and they sat at the table with a lamp burning between them and ate roasted chicken and talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing. And she watched his face in the lamplight and thought that she had not had a conversation of this quality with anyone in years, possibly ever, and felt something both alarming and wonderful shifting in her chest. He talked, when she asked, about what he wanted. He wanted the ranch to be healthy and sustainable in 50 years, not just 20. He wanted the land treated well. He wanted the people who worked it to be treated well. He said this not as an idealist says it with the fervent quality of someone who has chosen to believe it against evidence, but with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone for whom it was simply the way things were organized. "Refugio has worked that land as long as I have," he said. "I have been thinking for some time about whether there is a better arrangement than the current one. Whether a partnership of some form is not more honest." He looked at her. "Does that seem impractical to you?" "It seems right," she said without hesitation. He nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "it does." She thought about the injustice of the territories then, the ways that men like Refugio, who had worked land their whole lives, often ended up with nothing legal to show for it while men with money and standing accumulated ownership. She said so, carefully, watching his face. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are correct about that, and it is something I have the ability to address in a small way in my own operation and intend to." He paused. "It will not solve the larger problem." "No," she said, "but it is not nothing." "No," he agreed, "it is not nothing." She looked at him in the lamplight, this large, quiet man who did things the right way not because they were easy but because they were right, and felt the feeling in her chest settle into something that she recognized, with a mixture of exhilaration and calm as love. She did not say so, not yet. She was a woman who researched her choices, and love was the largest choice she had ever encountered, and she intended to be sure. But she was already quite sure. The Ketley situation came to a head in January. Owen had been documenting incidents: fence cuttings, missing cattle, a confrontation between two of Ketley's riders and Refugio on the South Road, and his Fort Worth lawyer, a sharp-minded man named Garrison, had been building a case. But Ketley had grown impatient, and in the second week of January, two of his men appeared at the Bancroft spread unannounced and made what they described as a final offer for the eastern section. Owen sent them away. They came back. He sent them away again, this time with a written refusal signed in his name and witnessed by Refugio, and a note to his lawyer in Fort Worth. 3 days later, someone fired a shot through the window of Owen's bunkhouse at night. No one was hurt, because Refugio had stepped out to check on the horses and was the only person awake, and he had dropped flat the moment he heard the glass break and stayed flat until dawn. Owen came to Millhaven the next morning and went straight to the town sheriff, a man named Talbot, and made a formal complaint. Gertrude found out from Alina Aldridge, who was at this point simply an integral part of how information moved through her life, and she went to Owen's wagon at the hitching rail in front of the sheriff's office and waited. When he came out, she was standing there with her arms crossed against the cold, and he stopped when he saw her. "Are you all right?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Refugio?" "Fine. Shaken, but fine." He came down the steps and stood in front of her, and she looked at his face and saw that he was controlled and steady, but beneath that steadiness was something tightly wound, something that had been asked to hold a great deal of weight. She said impulsively, "Come inside," and took hold of his arm and walked him into the diner across the street, where she ordered 2 cups of coffee and a plate of biscuits, and they sat in the warm interior, and she waited while he found his way to talking. He was not a man who processed things easily through speech. She had learned this, and she had also learned that he got there eventually if she was patient and did not fill the silence with her own noise. She sat and drank her coffee and let him think. "Talbot is going to look into it," he said at last. "Whether he will find anything substantial is another matter. Ketley has money and the sheriff's office has budget concerns." He looked at his hands around the coffee cup. "Garrison believes we have enough to file a civil complaint for the property interference. That will take time." "What do you need right now?" she asked. He looked up at her. The question seemed to catch him somewhere. "To not be alone with it for an hour," he said. And then, as though the admission had cost him something and he needed to balance the ledger, "That is a temporary need. I am generally quite capable of—" "Owen," she said. He stopped. "I know you are capable of it," she said. "I am not here because I think you are not capable. I am here because I want to be here." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right." "All right," she agreed. They sat for another hour, and she talked to him about the children in her school. And she told him about Thomas Carver's remarkable progress in reading, and about the elder Martinez boy, whose name was Pedro, who had written 3 pages of mathematics problems for her own entertainment, and whose mind was moving so fast she was struggling to keep pace with him. And about a girl named Ida who was 7 years old and who cried every morning for the first 10 minutes of school, and had eventually confided that she cried because she was afraid she would not understand the lessons and be embarrassed, and how Gertrude had rearranged the morning to give Ida 15 minutes of individual attention. Before the others arrived, and how the crying had stopped, she watched Owen listen. He listened with the same quality of attention he gave everything complete and careful. When she finished telling him about Ida, he said, "That was a kind thing to do." "It was the obvious thing to do," she said. "The obvious thing," he said quietly, "is not always the thing that gets done." She looked at him. He was looking at her with an expression she knew now, knew the way she knew certain passages in books that she had read so many times they were part of her, and what it meant when he looked at her that way was something she no longer had any doubt about. "Owen," she said. "Yes." I have something to tell you. He waited. She looked at the table for a moment, and then she looked at him and she said, I love you. I have been somewhat certain of it for a while, and now I am entirely certain, and I thought you should know, because you prefer things to be stated plainly, and so do I. The diner was quiet around them. Someone clattered dishes in the kitchen. From outside came the distant sound of a horse. Owen Bancroft sat very still for a moment, and she watched something move through his face that was so large and so unguarded that she felt she was seeing something private, something he did not show the world, and she felt the privilege of it. Then he said, I love you, Gertrude, in a voice that was low and very even and had a tremor in it that was the only evidence of what the words were costing him in courage. She felt her own chest do something that she thought later was probably audible. She nodded once and pressed her lips together and said, Good. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. You say that word a great deal. When things are good, she said, it seems accurate. He reached across the table and took her hand, and his hand was enormous around hers and very warm, and he held it with a gentleness that was conscious and deliberate. And they sat like that while the diner moved around them, and she thought she had never felt so entirely in the right place in her entire life. Talbot's investigation produced evidence that pointed clearly toward two of Ketley's ranch hands, and when confronted with Garrison's documentation and the testimony of Refugio, who gave a clear and steady account of the events he had witnessed over the preceding months, Ketley found himself in a position where continuing the campaign against the Bancroft spread would cost him considerably more than stopping. He agreed, through a legal process that Garrison navigated with precision, to pay restitution for the property damage and to formally relinquish any claim to the eastern section. The formal agreement was signed in March of 1879. Owen came to tell her that evening. He arrived at her door as the sun was going down and the sky was the color of apricots and roses, and he told her it was finished, and she saw the relief move through him like weather. What will you do now? She asked, standing in the doorway. He looked at her. The sky was extraordinary behind him. He was still in his work clothes, still dusty from the road, his hat in his hand. I have been thinking about that, he said. I have been thinking about it a great deal. He looked down at his hat and then back up at her. I have a question to ask you, and I want to be clear that this is not an impulsive question. I have been considering it seriously for some time. She felt her heart do something athletic. She waited. I would like to ask you to marry me, he said. I want to be your husband, and I want you on the land with me, and I want us to build something together. I am aware that is a significant thing to ask of a person, and I am aware that you have a life here that you have made for yourself and that you value, and I have thought about that. And I think there are arrangements that can be made so that you need not choose entirely between that life and a life with me if you want both. He paused. I want you to have everything you want. She looked at him standing in the last of the evening light with his hat in his hands and his gray eyes on her face, and all that careful, deliberate love radiating off him as steadily as heat from a stove. And she felt something so enormous move through her that it came out not as tears or words but simply as a long, quiet exhale, as though she had been holding her breath without knowing it for some time. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes, she said again more clearly. Owen, yes. He took one step forward, and then another, and she stepped forward too, and when he put his arms around her, slowly and carefully, she understood that this was how he did everything, with full attention, with full intention, with the complete and utter absence of anything half-hearted. She pressed her face against his chest, and he was warm and solid and smelled of dust and leather and the outdoors, and she felt the whole of him settle around her with the particular completeness of something that has been in motion for a long time and has finally arrived. I will speak to the school board, he said above her head. They will be disappointed, she said, but I think there is a solution. What solution? She pulled back enough to look up at him. I can continue teaching until the end of the school year, and in that time we can identify a replacement. And after that she paused. There is no reason a ranch cannot have a small school, for the children of the ranch hands, for Pedro Martinez and his brother and anyone else in the area who needs it." Owen looked at her with an expression that was full and warm and something close to wonder. "I had not thought of that," he said. "I think of it often," she said. "A school does not require a building owned by a government. It requires someone who can teach." "Yes," he said, "it does." He looked at her for another long moment. "Gertrude, Owen, I am very glad you came to Millhaven." "So am I," she said. They were married in May of 1879 in the same church hall where the harvest social had been held 8 months before. The fiddle player was there again, and played considerably better than he had at the social, or perhaps he had always played that well, and the difference was in Gertrude's willingness to hear it. Eleanor Aldridge wept cheerfully from the second pew, having apparently taken full personal credit for the entire arrangement. Refugio and Catalina sat with their 3 children in the 4th row, and Catalina had made Gertrude's wedding dress from ivory muslin with small embroidered flowers at the collar, a project that had taken 4 weeks, and produced something so beautiful that Gertrude had stood in front of the small mirror in her house and felt, for one of the only times in her life, that she looked exactly as she wanted to look. Owen stood at the front of the room in a dark suit he had apparently purchased new from a tailor in Fort Worth, and he was watching the door when she came through it, and she saw his face when he saw her, and the look on his face was something she kept for herself afterward, private and precious, a look that had no reserve in it whatsoever. Pastor Whitfield conducted the ceremony with considerable warmth, and only 2 anecdotes that ran slightly long, and Owen said his vows in the even, deliberate voice she knew, each word placed with the weight of a man who understood that words meant things and chose them accordingly. Gertrude said hers and felt them as physical facts, solid as the floor under her feet. When Pastor Whitfield declared them married and Owen kissed her carefully, warmly, with one large hand cupped around the side of her face, the room erupted in the cheerful noise of a small town celebrating one of its own, and Thomas Carver shouted something enthusiastic from the back row that his mother immediately hushed. The reception was held in the churchyard because the weather was perfect, and someone had strung lanterns between the fence posts, and the fiddle player got a second wind, and the dancing went on until well past dark. Gertrude danced with Owen twice, and she found that he danced the way he did everything else with steady competence and complete attention to his partner, and she felt, dancing with him in the lantern light with the Texas sky enormous and starry above them, that this was entirely and completely where she was meant to be. They drove out to the ranch in the dark, with Owen at the reins and Gertrude beside him, her shoulder against his arm, watching the stars track across the sky above the dark prairie grass. The ranch house was low and solid, built from timber and limestone in the practical style of a man who had thought carefully about what he needed and built exactly that and no more. There were 2 large rooms and a kitchen and a porch that ran the full length of the south side, and the second well stood 50 yards from the house, and at night you could hear the creak from the bedroom window. She stood on the porch on their first evening and looked out at the valley, which was silver and black in the moonlight, and Owen came and stood beside her, and they were quiet together for a long time. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." She turned to look at him. "I am not a woman who needs to be managed or handled. I suspect you know that." "I do know that," he said, "and I will need space to be the version of myself I have always been, the teacher. The person who reads too many books and has opinions about everything." "I know," he said. "I want that version of you specifically." He paused. "I would not have asked to marry a woman I wanted to diminish." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said. "That is why I said yes." He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into his side, and they stood on the porch of the ranch house and looked out at their valley and the stars above it. And Gertrude felt that all the threads of her life, the books and the teaching and the loneliness she had navigated quietly for years, and the courage it had taken to come to a new place and begin, had led with perfect logic to exactly here. The school she started the following September was held in the converted tool room behind the ranch house, which Owen and Refugio had spent the summer rebuilding, raising the ceiling, adding 2 windows for light, constructing proper desks from lumber that came in on the Fort Worth rail. There were 11 students on the first day, ranging from Pedro Martinez, who at 14 was doing mathematics that Gertrude suspected was beyond most of the adults in the county, to a 5-year-old girl named Rosa who was Catalina and Refugio's youngest, and who arrived on the first day holding a tin cup as though it were a credential. Gertrude taught every morning and 2 afternoons per week. The rest of her time was spent on the ranch, and she learned, slowly and with the same thorough approach she applied to everything, what the ranch needed and what she could contribute to it. She learned to ride Josephine properly, cantering along the creek road in the mornings with a confidence that pleased her enormously. She learned to read the cattle the way Owen read them, to know when an animal was off and when it was simply having a difficult day. She learned the names of the ranch hands and their families, and she had Catalina teach her the green chili stew, which turned out to require considerably more patience than she initially allocated to it, and produced something on the 3rd attempt that Owen declared excellent, which she took as high praise from a man who measured his words. By the autumn of 1879, she was entirely home. Not settled, she did not think of herself as a settling kind of person, but home, in the precise sense that the word deserves, which is not the absence of motion but the presence of a place to return to. In January of 1880, she told Owen she was expecting. She said it at dinner because she was a woman who believed that important things should be said plainly and not built up into occasions. She simply looked up from her plate and said, "Owen, I am going to have a baby." He set down his fork. He looked at her. She looked at him. The look on his face did things to her heart that she could not have narrated if required to do so. When, he said, "July," she said, "I believe July." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in a voice that had the careful quality of a man trying to contain something very large within the limits of his composure, "That is the finest thing I have ever been told." She felt tears prick her eyes, which surprised her. She was not generally a crier, and she pressed her lips together and nodded firmly. He came around the table and crouched down beside her chair, which given his size was a considerable project, and he took both her hands in his and looked at her face. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you feeling well?" "Extremely well," she said. "I am constitutionally very healthy." "Yes," he said, "you are." He held her hands for a moment. "Thank you," he said. Which was such an Owen Bancroft thing to say, so specific, so honest, so unlike what another man might have said, that she laughed, and he smiled the full smile she had spent months being allowed to see, and she thought she had never loved him more than she did in that exact moment. The summer of 1880 was hot and long and beautiful, and on the 15th of July, Gertrude brought into the world a boy of such magnificent dimensions that the doctor from Millhaven, who had come out to the ranch for the occasion, said admiringly that he had never seen a healthier or more substantial infant. He weighed 11 pounds and had Owen's gray eyes and Gertrude's stubborn mouth, and a voice that carried, as Owen pointed out with considerable satisfaction, across the entire ranch yard. They named him Samuel James Bancroft, Samuel for Gertrude's father and James for Owen's, both of them gone now, both of them honored in the weight of the name. Owen held his son for the first time with the same careful deliberateness he brought to everything, and Gertrude watched him from the bed, exhausted and entirely content, and saw that same unguarded openness in his face that she had seen once before, when she had first told him she loved him. "He is remarkable," Owen said, in a very quiet voice. "He is enormous," she said. "Yes," Owen said, with a satisfaction that was so comically transparent that she laughed, which made Samuel startle and blink his gray eyes open. Owen looked down at him, and something on Owen's face settled with a permanence that she understood was the look of a man whose life has fully arrived. Pedro Martinez and his brother came to see the baby the following week, and Pedro presented a card that he had written himself in careful lettering. Congratulations on the arrival of Samuel J. Bancroft. Pedro had also solved, on the back of the card, a mathematics problem of genuine sophistication that he had invented himself and worked out over 3 pages, which he gave to Gertrude because he said he thought she would like to see it. She studied it for a full hour after he left and made notes in the margins, and told him at the next school session that his solution was correct, and that she intended to write a letter to a professor at a university in Austin whose work she had read, because she believed Pedro deserved to know that his abilities placed him beyond anything she could personally teach him. Pedro said nothing for a moment. Then he said, with the careful dignity of a 14-year-old boy trying not to cry, "Thank you, Mrs. Bancroft." She wrote the letter that evening, at the desk in the schoolroom, with Samuel sleeping in the cradle that Owen had built from cedar in the spring, in the corner beside the window that looked out onto the valley. Owen was reading at the other end of the room, one of the books she had brought from her library. She had a great many books, and he had built her 3 shelves to accommodate them, and she had overflowed one of them already, and she looked up from the letter at one point and watched him reading in the lamplight, one large hand propped under his chin, entirely absorbed, and she felt such a wave of simple happiness that it came out as a sound, just a small sound, a breath. He looked up. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. She paused. "I was just noticing." He looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes, and the corner of his mouth did the thing she loved. He went back to his book. She went back to her letter, and the lamp burned between them, and the valley was quiet outside, and Samuel made a small sound in his sleep and settled again. The partnership arrangement with Refugio was formalized in the fall of 1880. Owen's Fort Worth lawyer Garrison drew up the documents, and Refugio signed them at the kitchen table of the ranch house, with Catalina standing beside him and Owen on the other side. And afterward Catalina made the green chili stew, and they all ate together. And there was a quality in the room that was above and beyond the food, a kind of rightness that did not require naming but was felt by everyone present. Refugio looked at the documents for a long time after dinner. He said in a measured tone, "I did not expect this." Owen said, "You should have." Refugio looked at him. "Most men in this territory would not have done it." "Then they are making a mistake," Owen said. Gertrude, sitting across the table, looked at her husband and felt the love in her chest the way she felt the warmth from the stove, pervasive, steady, entirely reliable. By 1881, the Bancroft spread had grown to include 2 additional employees, and a contract with the railroad that provided stability through 2 dry summers that devastated other operations in the area. Ketley's ranch, it emerged, had overextended itself, and by the spring of 1882 he was quietly selling off sections to cover debts. The eastern well, the one he had wanted badly enough to send men with rifles in the dark, remained firmly and legally in the hands of the Bancroft-Martinez partnership. Gertrude's school grew as well. By the spring of 1881 she had 14 students, and by fall she had 19, drawn from the ranch and from 3 neighboring properties whose owners had asked, with some diffidence, whether the school might be available to their children as well. She said yes, because she was not a woman who hoarded education, and the tool room was expanded again, this time by adding a second room on the north side that Owen and Refugio and 2 of the ranch hands built over the course of an October weekend. Pedro Martinez, in the spring of 1882, received a letter from the professor in Austin, a response to the letter that Gertrude had written nearly 2 years prior, following and then following again, with the determination of a woman who did not accept silence as a final answer. The professor expressed interest in Pedro's work and offered a place for him to study, with financial support arranged through the university. It was not a common thing. It was, by the standards of Texas in 1882, an extraordinary thing. Pedro brought the letter to Gertrude on a Tuesday morning, and she read it standing on the porch of the school room with the spring light coming down and Pedro standing very still in front of her. "Well," she said. "Well, is it real?" Pedro asked. "It is entirely real," she said. "I know this professor's name. He is a serious man. This is a serious offer." Pedro said nothing. He looked at the letter in her hands. She looked at him, this boy who had arrived in her school at 12 with a mathematical mind that should have been given every resource the world possessed, and who had, through no fault except the accident of circumstance, been offered instead only what she could give him. She thought about the injustice of that, the grinding, casual injustice of it, and then she thought about this letter, this opening in the wall, and felt a fierce and grateful hope. "You must go," she said. "My family," he began. "We will speak to your family," she said, "together." They did that evening, at the Refugio and Catalina's house near the ranch, and Owen was there, and he said what he always said when a situation called for practical support. He said what needed doing and offered what he could, which in this case was the cost of the journey and a month's room and board while Pedro settled himself, offered quietly and without drama as though it were the obvious thing. Refugio and Catalina sat with the letter and the weight of what it meant, and then Catalina said yes, because Catalina was a woman who understood that the future could not be held back, only aimed carefully. Pedro left for Austin in August of 1882, and Gertrude stood at the road to see him off and felt the particular complex pride of a teacher watching a student walk through a door that she had helped to open, and it was one of the best moments of her life. Samuel Bancroft, at 2 years old, was a force of nature in miniature, enormous for his age, with a disposition that combined Owen's steadiness with Gertrude's restless curiosity, in a combination that resulted in a child who could sit entirely still for 20 minutes examining a beetle, and then launch himself at top speed across the yard for no apparent reason. He adored Refugio's youngest daughter Rosa with a devotion that Catalina found tremendously amusing. He was beginning to talk in full sentences, and his first complete sentence, memorably, had been a question about why the creek made a different sound after the rain, delivered to Owen with an expression of profound philosophical inquiry. Owen had answered the question in full, with a seriousness that the 2-year-old probably did not entirely follow but seemed to find satisfying. Gertrude had watched this and thought that Owen was going to be extraordinary at fatherhood, and that she had been right about that from the beginning. She discovered in the spring of 1882 that she was expecting again. She told Owen the same way she had told him the first time, plainly and at the dinner table. He reacted with the same quality of contained joy, though this time he also looked at Samuel, who was industriously mashing a piece of cornbread into an unrecognizable form in his bowl, and said, "Samuel is going to be an older brother." Samuel looked up. "What is a brother?" he said. "It is someone who is always on your side," Owen said. Samuel considered this gravely. "Good," he said, and went back to the cornbread. Gertrude laughed until she had to put down her fork. Their second child arrived in November of 1882, in a storm that had been building for 3 days, and that broke the night the baby decided to arrive with a display of thunder and lightning that seemed like deliberate theatrical timing. The doctor from Millhaven arrived just in time, slightly damp but entirely competent, and Gertrude brought into the world a daughter who was considerably smaller than Samuel had been, but made up for it in volume and expressed opinions. They named her Clara Rose Bancroft, Clara for Owen's first wife, whose bravery deserved to be carried forward; Rose for the embroidered flowers on Catalina's work, for the thing that grows in unlikely places. Owen held her in the aftermath of the storm, with the rain still moving off to the south and the dawn beginning to show through the window, and he looked at his daughter with an expression that was quiet and full and private in the way she had seen him be when something mattered enormously, and he said very softly, "Hello, Clara." Gertrude, from the bed, said, "She looks like she will have opinions." "Good," Owen said. "That is my word," she said. He looked at her. He was smiling fully, the smile she had worked for, the smile she had earned, the smile that was only for her and their children, and the rare moments when the world arranged itself into something genuinely right. "Good," he said again, deliberately just for her. By 1883, the ranch was running well. The school had 22 students, and Millhaven had grown enough to warrant a second general store and a telegraph office that connected it to Fort Worth and beyond. The world was changing, as it always is, and some of the changes were welcome, and some were complicated, and some were both simultaneously. But on the Bancroft spread the essential things held steady. Alina Aldridge came to visit in the spring of 1883 with her husband and stayed for a Sunday dinner that became an occasion. And Alina walked through the school room and the ranch house and out along the creek with Gertrude and said, at the end of the afternoon, "You are entirely happy, aren't you?" "Entirely," Gertrude said. "Good," Alina said, which made Gertrude laugh. "I learned that word from Owen," she said. "I know," Alina said. "He has always used it correctly. Good things should be called good." She looked out at the valley, which was green in the spring light, the creek running high with snowmelt from the hills, the cottonwoods putting out their new leaves in pale gold green. "I was not entirely certain you two would find your way to each other," she admitted. "He is a private man and you were new and careful." "I am not particularly careful," Gertrude said. "You are enormously careful," Alina said kindly. "You are simply also enormously decided once you have finished being careful, which makes it look like boldness to the outside observer." Gertrude considered this. "That is actually a fairly accurate analysis." "I have known Owen Bancroft for 9 years," Alina said. "He is exactly the same way." She paused, "which is probably why it worked." Gertrude looked at the valley and thought about a harvest social in the autumn of 1878, and a large man stepping back in the crowd to give her room, and the fact that she had noticed that first before she noticed anything else, and what it had meant that she had noticed it. She thought about the particular honesty of that gesture, not the deliberate performance of courtesy, but the automatic, unconsidered expression of a character that had room-making built into its foundations. She thought about how she had known something in that moment, some early version of the knowing that had taken months to fully arrive. She said, "I noticed him before I knew I was noticing him." Alina nodded slowly. "That is how it works," she said, "when it works properly." Gertrude thought this was absolutely right. Samuel came running down the creek path at full speed at that moment, covered in mud to a degree that suggested either an accident or a deliberate project, followed at a more dignified pace by Owen, who was carrying Clara, who was wearing a hat that was enormous for her head, and was holding it on with both small hands and looking entirely serious about it. Owen reached Alina and Gertrude and looked at Samuel with a measured expression. "He found the mud," he said. "Was the creek involved?" Gertrude asked. "The creek was very involved," Owen said. "Then he is going to need a full change," Gertrude said. Samuel looked up at them with mud on his nose and profound contentment in his expression. "The mud is warm," he reported. "I am sure it is," Gertrude said. She took Clara from Owen and settled her daughter on her hip, and felt the small, warm weight of her, and the particular textures of the evening gathering around her, the light coming long and golden across the valley. Samuel chattering about the mud to Alina, who was listening with the expression of a woman who has always wanted grandchildren, and is prepared to claim any available children as informal substitutes. Owen standing beside her with his hand resting lightly on her back in the simple, steady way that meant he was present and close and hers. Clara took hold of a strand of Gertrude's hair with both small hands and held on with the conviction of someone who has decided that this is where she is staying. Owen looked at them, and his face was completely open, all the reserve and the careful management that the world generally saw fully absent, the way it only was when it was just them. And what was there instead was something enormous and uncomplicated and very deeply settled. "What are you thinking?" she asked him. He looked at her. He looked at Clara, who was still holding her hair. He looked at Samuel, who had moved on from talking about the mud and was now showing Alina a rock he had found. He looked at the valley and the creek and the cottonwood trees at the bend where the light came through in a particular way. "That I am exactly where I am supposed to be," he said. "All of it. Exactly this." She leaned into his side for a moment, Clara between them, and said, "Yes." He put his arm around her, and Clara made a sound of protest at having her architecture disrupted, and then settled again. And the evening moved over the valley in its slow, unhurried way, and the creek ran on, and the lights came on in the ranch house, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called once, the same as it had called on the night of the social, the same as it always did, and the stars began to appear one by one in the deepening blue above the hills. In the years that followed, the Bancroft spread became what Owen had always intended it to be. A place built on the right principles, running well, giving back to the land something close to what it gave. The school continued, and several of Gertrude's students went on to things she would never have predicted, not just Pedro, who completed his studies in Austin and came back to Texas to teach mathematics at a school in San Antonio, and sent them a letter every Christmas. But others, children of ranch hands and neighboring farmers, children who had needed someone to show them that they were capable of more than circumstance had allotted them. Samuel grew into a young man who had his father's steady character and his mother's relentless curiosity, and who decided at 16 that he wanted to study law, because he had grown up listening to his parents discuss the injustices of land ownership and water rights, and the ways that people without power were maneuvered out of what was rightfully theirs. And he had decided he wanted to know how to fight that with something more lasting than individual acts of decency, important as those were. Owen heard this announcement with the same expression he gave most important information, carefully, with complete attention. Then he said that law seemed like a very sound choice. Gertrude put down her fork and looked at her son and felt the pride move through her like a current. Clara, at 9 years old, was teaching herself to read Spanish from a primer that Catalina had given her, and was doing it with a systematic thoroughness that made Gertrude look at Owen and say, without a word, that their daughter was going to be entirely fine. Owen, without a word, agreed completely. On an October evening in 1889, 11 years after the harvest social at the Millhaven Church Hall, Owen and Gertrude sat on the south porch of the ranch house in the particular gold hour of a Texas autumn afternoon, the light coming long and warm across the valley, the cottonwood trees at the creek bend showing their autumn color. She had a book open in her lap that she was not reading. He had a cup of coffee on the rail in front of him. They had been sitting in comfortable silence for 20 minutes, which was one of the great accomplishments of their marriage. The discovery that silence between them was not absence but presence, that the quiet they shared was its own kind of conversation. She said, "Do you remember the social, the harvest social," he said, "when you arrived?" "Yes, yes," he said, "I remember." She looked at the valley. "I noticed you before I knew I was noticing you," she said. "You stepped back to give me room. That was the first thing I noticed." He was quiet for a moment. "I almost knocked someone over doing it," he said. "I heard a yelp." She laughed. "Yes, you apologized specifically for that." General apologies are a way of apologizing without taking responsibility for anything in particular, she finished. "I know, I have heard you say that." She paused. "It still applies." He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "it does." The light moved across the valley. A hawk turned in a long, slow circle above the creek. From inside the house came the sound of Clara practicing her Spanish verbs in a low, determined murmur. "Owen," she said. "Yes. This is exactly what I wanted, all of it, exactly this." He reached across and took her hand, and she turned her palm up and held his, and they sat like that in the autumn light with the creek running below, and the cottonwood trees doing what they always did, showing their gold, letting the light through, making the particular sound that was between rain and applause. Gertrude Barrett, who had arrived in Millhaven with a trunk full of books and a pair of worn leather boots and nobody who knew her name, sat in the home she had built with the man she loved, and felt the specific and irreplaceable satisfaction of a life that had been chosen with care and lived with intention and had turned out to be, beyond all reasonable calculation, more than she had dared to expect. Good, she thought. Just that word. Complete and accurate and enough. Owen was looking at the valley. His profile was familiar to her now in the way that the valley was familiar, not known so completely that it stopped being interesting, but known well enough that it was part of how she understood the world, a constant point from which she oriented herself. He was still the largest man she knew. He still moved with the same unhurried deliberateness he had brought to everything since the moment she had first seen him, creating space where there was none, doing what needed doing without ceremony or performance. He turned and found her watching him. He looked back at her without surprise, without self-consciousness, with the total ease of a man who has nothing to hide from the person beside him. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I was just noticing." He held her gaze for a moment, and the corner of his mouth did the thing she had loved since the first time she saw it, that slow crease, that beginning of a smile that opened all the way into the full thing, rare and warm and entirely real. "Good," he said. And the October light moved over them both, and the valley held them in its wide and patient way, and everything that mattered was exactly where it was supposed to be.